Really delighted to get to meet the folks who are advocating for all these issues and really trying to make Raleigh better. I'm also very interested in what jurisdictions like Raleigh and Wake County and North Carolina are doing, because while New Yorkers tend to think that we have a lot of good ideas, actually a lot of the work that is so interesting and innovative that's going on around the country is really happening in places like this. And the Furman Center has what we call the Housing Lab, which studies what cities around the country are doing on affordable housing and urban policy. And so it's a real treat to get to hear from you all about the kinds of things that you're doing. And while I have only been in Raleigh a couple of times, all of the times that I come, it seems to either snow or be very cold. So I'm a little, I think you're telling me that you don't really want me here, but I have enormous admiration. And so when Thomas called and asked me to do this, I thought, I could see Mitch Silver. And so I had the pleasure of working with Mitch in New York, and really delighted to hear that he's one of your new city council members. When I had the chance to work with him, there are few people in the world who are as dedicated and creative and visionary and kind as Mitch Silver. So it's really an honor to be here. So thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Bert. And thank you, Hattie, for having me. And so my charge, as I understood it, was to talk a little bit about the affordable housing crisis, but more to talk about what are places around the country doing to address the crisis, and what do we know about whether what they're doing is working or not working, and how it's working. So I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about how we think about the crisis, and then really talk through some of what's going on around the country in terms of innovations, some of it right here, but some of it all over the country. So of course, it costs a lot to live in Raleigh, to rent in Raleigh. About $1,825 a month is the median rent according to Zillow. There are, of course, debates about exactly what the right number is, but that's a high number. And that compares to, oops, I think I'm going backwards. That compares to a national average of about $2,100, which us New Yorkers think is just incredibly cheap, but for everybody else, it's not. We understand. But the real issue here is that means that a household has to make about $75,000 a year in order to afford that rent, right? To be able to afford it, the usual measure that we use is that you shouldn't be spending more than about 30% of your income for your housing expenses. And what this graph here shows is all of these people over here to the left side of that 75,000 number really are struggling, to put it mildly, to afford the kind of rent that you're seeing in Raleigh, and for that matter, all across North Carolina and all across the United States. There aren't very many and a very high share of the population that is on the right side of that 75,000 limit or amount that's required. And that really shows just how painful the cost of housing is. And it's not just a problem for renters, of course, but also for homeowners, although renters are often the lower income of those two different groups. Unfortunately, we've seen rents increase by quite a bit. You see here the rise in rents in Raleigh from 2015. And so that would not be such a terrible problem if incomes were keeping up with that, but of course they're not. And so if you look at the graph on the top is the graph for house prices, for house price index, and the graph on the bottom is the change in household income. And you see house cost going up very steadily and very markedly, and you see our incomes growing at a very spotty, would be one way to think about it. We saw incomes increase prior to the pandemic, but after the 2008 crisis. But then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we saw that incomes are not keeping up even with inflation in many cases, but certainly are not keeping up with that very sharp rise of rents that you see on the right-hand side there. So when you have rents growing faster than incomes, you have way too many people paying more than they can afford for rent. And in the Raleigh-Cary metro, about half of renters are paying more than that 30% amount, and another 19% of homeowners are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. So you've got people who are foregoing other things, and often those things are really tragic. They're foregoing medicine, they're foregoing food, they're foregoing education for their children. They're foregoing a lot of things that we need as a society for people to be able to have, right? And people need, obviously. And we know that part of the problem is that we just have too few homes that are available and affordable at different income levels. So you see here that at or below 100% of median, so at the median income for Raleigh, you have about 106 units for every 100 people, every 100 households that are looking. But if you go down to the bottom there, extremely low income, so people making below 30% or below of the median income, you only have 40 homes that are available and affordable for those people. And so the crisis here is really in terms of the housing supply, and housing supply at different income ranges and at different rent levels for those income ranges. So part of the problem, as I said, is we're just not building enough housing. Raleigh is actually doing quite well compared to many, many places around the country. I will point out that you're building almost 3 times what we're building in New York City, and that's why you have so many New Yorkers who are coming down here. So I will try to do my part up in New York to build more housing so that we're not pushing people out to places like Raleigh. But you still see even Raleigh, with all that it's building, is way below or considerably below places like Miami City, Atlanta. All of these are cities, and about equal to Washington, D.C., right? And the areas that you're so far exceeding, of course, are areas that are losing people because our costs are just too high. That has all kinds of consequences for places like New York that are losing our talent, that are losing our diversity, that are losing so much that makes New York City a place that I love, but people are coming to places like this instead because of that affordability crisis. That's good for you, bad for us, but it's also not a good way to run a country, that people can't live where they want to live, near their families, where they want to go to school, those kinds of things, but instead are driven to places or are attracted to places because of the things that they offer at an affordable amount. And the part of what's going on here is that even though you're building at quite a good clip compared to all the rest of us, you're also, of course, seeing a very large influx of people, and you started with a deficit, right? If you look back over the history, I didn't put the graph in, but if you look back over the history of building here in Raleigh and Wake County, you see that there were years, there were decades, really, when you weren't producing enough housing to deal with your current population, and so you were falling behind, and that deficit has to be made up, and you have to address the needs of the people who are coming in. So that therein lies the problem. You're building a lot, but still isn't enough given the growth that you're seeing, given the deficits that need to be filled. and given the importance of housing. Now, one thing that people sometimes say is, well, this is a 2024 problem. It's not. It's a problem that's really been growing over the last 20 years. If you look at this graph on this map on the left, this was the share of tracts within a county throughout the southeastern United States where the median, a renter at the median income could afford the median rent, right? So if you think back to the slides that we had earlier and saw how few people could afford that $75,000 household income that you needed to pay the median rent. In 2000, you only had a few counties that were red, right? Everything else was mostly green, indicating that a very large share of the census tracts within that county were affordable, where the median rent was affordable to the person making the median income, right? If you look at what's happening in the last data that we had available was 2019, and you see how many tracts are now and how many counties in North Carolina are now bright red, right? Meaning that less than 10% of the tracts within the county, a person making the median income can afford the median rent, right? That's a shocking transfer in just 19 years, right? It's a shocking development, and it's a shocking look at just how tough it is for families to find housing throughout the southeastern United States, which is one of the more affordable places in the United States. So it's really at a crisis point, and of course that crisis has a lot of consequences. It has consequences in terms of homelessness, has consequences in terms of, as I said, people having to spend their money on housing that really needs to be going in other places, and also consequences in terms of, we know from lots and lots of evidence that having a stable, safe, quality place to live helps you do better in school, helps you do better in your job, helps you make more income over your life. It has enormous consequences, and so it's a problem that we need to solve. So one of the things that we have to think about before we get to, well, what are some of the solutions is, well, why are we having so much trouble? Why is housing so unaffordable? And why is it so hard to get more housing built? And so one issue is that if we think housing prices and rents are going up, part of the reason is, look at this incredibly steep increase in the cost of construction, the labor costs, the supply costs, the financing costs, the operating costs of buildings. All of that has gone up remarkably, increased by almost 50% just since COVID hit in 2019. And so it is incredibly expensive to build an apartment building, to build a home, to build a single family house or a duplex. And that's exacerbated by the problem that most of what gets built in the United States today has to be permitted, right? It's not as of right. And Raleigh, of course, made great progress in 2021, 2022 in making more of the what we call gentle density or missing middle housing, the duplexes, the triplexes, the quadplexes, making that as of right within Raleigh. But still, a lot of the larger apartment buildings, a lot of the larger developments require discretionary approvals. And where you have those discretionary approvals, you have a lot of time and cost and uncertainty and risk that drives up the cost of development. And where you have permitting processes that involve a lot of discretion, you tend to also get a lot of opposition. And there's a fair amount of evidence that where you have a lot of community opposition to a particular development proposal, regardless of what the standards on the paper are, the standards in terms of the zoning ordinance or the subdivision regulation, you often will not get that development through. Or when you do get it through, it's half the size and twice the cost, right? Because you've spent a lot of time, a lot of money and a lot of risk in getting it through the permitting process. So why is there so much opposition is one thing that we have to think about as we're thinking about, well, what are the solutions? And one reason is that people worry this is going to bring change. It's going to bring change to my neighborhood. I love my neighborhood. I love my home within my neighborhood. And I worry that higher density housing, that duplexes, that the different kinds of things that we're talking about will change my neighborhood in a way that makes it less desirable, less feels unfamiliar to me, feels foreign to me. Another reason why we have opposition is that many people want to see the kinds of housing and the kinds of people that they're used to seeing in their neighborhoods, and don't want to see different kinds, more intense housing, more dense housing. Sometimes, of course, people are worried about the environmental effects, as they should be. We are obviously having tremendous environmental, habitat, energy, climate change issues that are related to development that we need to solve. And so that is, of course, an issue. And then also people fear that development will bring wealthier people. Those wealthier people will want fancier stores. Those wealthier people will be willing and able to pay more for the housing, and that will drive costs up. And so they worry about new development bringing change that will make the area more expensive and drive them out. So all of those worries are perfectly legitimate worries that people in good faith and in discussions like we're having tonight and like WakeUP, Wake County, and RaleighForward try to promote, need to tackle and need to address forthrightly. So let's get to, well, what are some other areas across the country looking for solutions, and what are they doing? And we're seeing, in part because of groups like WakeUP and RaleighForward elevating the debate on these topics, we're seeing an enormous amount of activity. There are more than 20 states that in the last few years have fairly radically revised their land use systems, right? And we have dozens and dozens of cities across the United States that are trying new approaches to get more housing. And so I want to talk for just a minute about what some of those look like. One thing I want to note is in those 20 states, some are red, some are blue, some are purple. This is a nonpartisan issue when you think about it across the country, and you're seeing states like Utah that are seeing enormous growth, but are red, more conservative states, adopting some of the exact same techniques and levers as a state like California or Massachusetts. You're seeing some states get left behind, unfortunately New York being one of those, as we can't seem to get our act together to pass statewide land use reform. But you are seeing tremendous innovation across a whole range of states with a whole range of political perspectives, of different kinds of challenges. And that's, I think, encouraging, because it shows that we can come together on some of these issues, and that we can look to a wide variety of states and cities across the nation for ideas. So I'm going to talk about the main kinds of levers that we're seeing, right? Let me just summarize here, and then I'm going to dig into some of these and show you some examples. So one of the things that states are doing is requiring local governments to do more planning. Many people in the room are in the urban planning profession, so that's good news, and consistent with what we teach in places like my school, that we need more planning about and more coordination between our transportation, between our environmental protection, between our housing, and so some states are requiring their local governments to do much more planning. Some are actually mandating that every municipality have a particular number or a particular share of new housing, and especially new housing that is income restricted, affordable, right? Some are requiring their local governments to allow particular types of housing, ADUs, transit-oriented housing, things like that. Some are requiring particular densities, right? Requiring that development around transit be at 21 units an acre or 33 units an acre, those kinds of things. Some are mandating changes, very fundamental changes in the kinds of processes that we use to decide whether or not to grant a permit to designate a historic building or a historic neighborhood, those kinds of things. Some are tackling our love affair with the car and requiring that cities give up their parking minimums and don't require or require less parking to be built along with housing. Some override local zoning on particular kinds of properties in order to get more housing, and especially affordable housing built on those particular types of land. Some there are a variety of enforcement mechanisms that states are using. One of the most, I would say, that goes the furthest is to allow developers to essentially enforce the state's requirements by bringing lawsuits or by getting to use essentially expedited and less discretionary processes if a jurisdiction is not doing its fair share of housing. Another thing that states have done, although they have tended to move away from this when they see that that it's slower than what we need given the crisis, is that they give local governments a menu and say, here are some ideas, you pick, it's up to you, you know your jurisdiction better, but you have to pick 5 of them and you have to put them into effect quickly. And then of course, as Eric said, money matters, and so incentives, tax abatements, tax exemptions, and preferences for state funding, for transportation and other things that come in sometimes are used to make this more palatable. So let me give some examples and really my goal here is to get our creative juices flowing about what kinds of things could be done. And I know you are already in that discussion, and you in Raleigh and in North Carolina and more generally have already done some of these things, but hopefully this will spark some ideas and also tell you who else is doing these things so that you can be in touch with them and find out what they're doing and how it's working. So as I mentioned, the first thing that many jurisdictions do is to say, hey, let's do some planning. Let's try to figure out what our housing needs are. Let's come up with a strategy and a plan for addressing those needs and put that into effect. So some jurisdictions like Arizona requires that localities assess their needs and make those needs public and report on their progress towards making those needs. Now, planning, of course, is not a new subject. California has required its jurisdictions to plan for about the last 50 years, but it took about 40 to convince the municipalities that they were really serious. California has finally done that and gotten serious. So it now gives, for example, the state housing department and the attorney general the ability to enforce the planning requirement. It used to leave that to the developers. It now allows them, or requires them really, to enforce it. And the statute imposes a minimum fine, $10,000 a unit that's missing, that hasn't been provided, but that the plan indicates is needed, or $50,000 a unit if the jurisdiction has acted in bad faith. And California shut down one of the major ways that recalcitrant local governments were getting around the issue, which was to say, oh yes, we plan on rezoning this piece of land to build affordable housing there. The fact that it is now our police station and we don't have a plan for another police station, or the fact that it is underwater, or those kinds of things, never mind, don't get too involved in the details. Now California says, actually, folks, you have to have sufficient water and sewer and utilities. It has to be accessible. It has to be available. It has to be on the market. So getting serious about those kinds of planning exercises. So Connecticut, Colorado, Florida, Oregon, Colorado and Florida and Oregon are relatively recent in the last couple of years that they've required planning. There are organizations around the United States, the Lincoln Land Institute, among others, that are really trying to help local governments who want to plan do that and have the resources and the expertise that they need in order to do that. So that's, I think we're starting to see some real results from that. The second major lever is to mandate either a specific number or a specific percentage of new housing and new affordable housing. So this is a technique, of course, that New Jersey in its Mount Laurel decision from the 1970s pioneered and is now finally really seeing the results of. Communities across New Jersey are finally meeting their mandated fair share requirements and building affordable housing. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island all require that jurisdictions have about 10% of their housing stock as income restricted. And if you do not meet that, if you do not have that, then the builder, a builder proposing a particular development can go straight to a expedited permitting and sort of one-stop permitting process to get that development built. And then you have other states like Oregon that say, okay, look, when you're doing your planning, you need to plan to have enough housing at each of those income levels that I showed on the graph before, right? It's fine to have 104 units that are available to people who can afford the median rent, but you also need to have apartments that are available for the people who are only making 30% of AMI and not the median income. So a different approach, but related, is to require localities to allow specific types of housing. And one of the most popular, look at that long list of almost, I think it's almost 15 states that really in the last 5 years have said, you must allow local governments, you must allow developers and homeowners to build accessory dwelling units. What used to be called mother-in-law apartments, the apartment above the garage, the cottage in the backyard for your college-age student, those kinds of things, the alley flats in Austin. A wide range of small housing types that can go in the backyard or over the garage, as I said, or as a separate apartment within a single-family house. And this has been quite successful in the areas that have done it. In California, for example, ADUs now make up more than 20% of all the building permits that are being granted. And you have a whole industry that's developed to make that to make that easier, to make it more feasible. Sort of an ADU on the truck. You pour the foundation, the next day a fully built house shows up, they put it on the foundation, and there you go. And so that we're seeing a lot of success across the country on those kinds of things. The other area is in transit-oriented development, and you have California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Maryland, Rhode Island, Vermont, all requiring their local governments to allow greater density near transit in order to take advantage of the fact that if you're near transit, you don't need to have so many cars. You can, and we want housing there to be especially affordable to take advantage of that transit housing connection. So communities achieve it in different ways. Massachusetts is requiring that you zone around every transit stop that you zone an area of reasonable size to allow multifamily housing or housing in specific densities. Maryland says if you build anywhere within a 3/4 of a mile of a rail transit stop, and your 15% of your homes are affordable, you get a 30% bonus. You get to build 30% more than you would otherwise build, so that we get that greater density around transit areas. Another technique is to just require localities to allow more density. So this is the one technique is let's get more of what we call the missing middle, the sort of starter homes, the homes for middle income people. And one way of doing that is that many jurisdictions have adopted is to say any area, any lot that is now zoned for single family homes can automatically, as of right, have a duplex or a triplex, or in some places even a quadplex. And in some places, New York City is trying to do this now, to have a small apartment building on corner lots in those single family neighborhoods. And the states, of course, have learned the hard way that sometimes municipalities are not on board. Many suburban areas are not on board for this. And so the states have limited the ways in which the local government can stymie this kind of development, and through processes or through requirements. So other places like Florida have said, look, any time that you have a commercial area and you have a mid-sized apartment building being built, that apartment building can be built at least 50% larger than any other requirement in the city, right? So automatically you get 50% more than the highest density in any other part of the city. Maine says just you get 2.5 times, right? The density of every other part of the city if you build more multifamily affordable developments. The approval process is a major sticking point. It's an area for people to communicate their concerns, their fears. It's a critically important step in the process, but it sometimes can go awry, or can just be so risky that developers choose to go elsewhere or choose to build other things. So you have a wide variety of techniques here. Massachusetts has said, look, we used to require that zoning changes had to be approved by 2/3 of a vote. We're going to lower that to a simple majority so that you don't have a supermajority requirement for all of these that gets in the way. Some states say, look, we've allowed you to do discretionary approvals. That's not working. In these kinds of housing or in these kinds of circumstances, you can only use ministerial review, which means you look at the list of standards, you try to figure out whether or not the development meets those standards, and if it does, it's permitted. You don't have any other discretion based upon community character or those kinds of very vague kinds of criteria that recalcitrant local governments can sometimes use. California has gone the furthest in saying you cannot deny a permit unless you, the local government, show in written findings that by a preponderance of the evidence, the project fails objective health and safety requirements, and its failure cannot be fixed by any improvements or mitigation in the project plan, right? So it shifts the burden of proof to the local government that does not now have that burden of proof. It requires that the standards being used be limited to public health and safety, that they be objective, which it defines as, I can look it up in a book, I can see exactly what it is that I'm supposed to be meeting here. And shifts not just the burden of proof, but also raises the standard of proof to say, we're not talking anymore about, is this merely rational? You have to show us that by a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not, this would actually cause harm to public health and safety. So that's a dramatic shift. Only California has done that, but other jurisdictions are certainly looking at it. And this notion of our standards are just too vague, right? We have, in my casebook, I have a remarkable case where somebody's trying to build a commercial building in a downtown area, and the planning commission, one planning commissioner says, well, I don't really like that blue. I think the window should be a little bit deeper. And another one says, well, I like that blue, but I think the window should be this. And how is the developer supposed to navigate those kinds of very vague and frankly, personality-based or idiosyncratic standards? So a number of jurisdictions are saying, no, we got to get real here and have clear, objective, knowable standards, and standards that the standard that governs are the standards that were in place at the time that you submitted your proposal. You can't change the standards once you see what I've done and then make it illegal by changing the standards once I file my petition. Washington State limits the number of public hearings, because one thing that can happen is you can get opposition and then you can get 4 or 5 or 6 public hearings that drag the process on and raise the cost. Some states have limited or cut back on environmental review. Some states, more states now, are prohibiting minimum parking standards. Some are just capping it. So for example, New Hampshire says you can only require 1.5 parking spaces per home. Montana and Vermont say 1. Colorado and Florida say none. And many, many cities have said you cannot require any minimum parking for new housing. And then some states say, look, we have certain kinds of land that could be really useful for affordable housing or for new housing. Let's do something on those pieces of land. So Oregon has what we call, and what is now being taken up by the New York State legislature, what is sometimes called the Yes in God's Backyard proposal, where if a piece of land is owned by a nonprofit or a religious organization, it automatically is zoned for multifamily as long as that multifamily includes some affordable, or in some cases, all affordable. Similarly, lots of states have realized that their transit authorities own a lot of land, and so they've automatically rezoned all of that land to allow, the state has rezoned it, not the local government, to allow multifamily development on those kinds of lands. I mentioned the builder's remedy, where states are saying, look, if you haven't met your planning requirements, then, or if you don't have 10% affordable housing, a builder can come in and get an expedited approval process, and your ability to deny that development is on very limited grounds, again, having to do with public health and safety. Okay, I'm going to skip that one because it's over. And then, of course, providing funding, which is critically important because, as I'm sure you all have experienced, many, many jurisdictions do not have the money to plan, to start significant planning processes if they haven't already done that. Okay, so bottom line, are these working? What do we know about whether or not any of these are working? So my colleagues and I, several years ago in 2019, published a review article that said, look, there is a lot of what we call supply skepticism. People are very skeptical that having more housing will actually do anything to make it more affordable. That's odd, because when you ask those same people, like, well, what happens when you have more cars on the market? They say prices will fall, but they don't believe that having more housing will actually make prices either limit rent growth or limit or lower rents. So why is that, is the puzzle that we were trying to understand, and what does the research show about that? So we published an article in 2019, and we showed that there were serious gaps in the evidence, that, you know, we weren't, the economists, the folks who run centers like mine, we're not meeting the challenge of showing exactly what is happening as a result of these kinds of reforms. And we challenged all the folks who work in the field, hey, we need evidence about this. You know, let's come up with, let's try to figure out what's really happening here. So we just are publishing, it's not out yet, but I'm happy to share it with anyone who wants it. It's coming out in the next few weeks, actually, that reviews all the evidence up to last month, basically. And the review of all the evidence, I think, shows a couple of key things. One is that increasing the housing supply does lower rents or slow rent growth in the city as a whole or the region as a whole, right? So one issue is, what does it do to the entire town, right? The second issue is, well, what does it do to my neighborhood, right? If I'm getting more housing supply in my neighborhood, am I seeing a slowing of rent growth or an actual decline in rents? And that's a tougher nut to crack, because having more housing brings more competition, which should lower the cost of housing. On the other hand, it also brings, as I mentioned earlier, higher income people who have different tastes, who have different needs, for desires for amenities, and that amenity effect might actually drive the cost of housing up. So what happens in that situation? And what the evidence shows is that, at least in some circumstances, and we're trying to do more work to articulate exactly what the circumstances that are needed are, adding supply also reduces rents or slows the rent growth within the neighborhood in which the new housing is being built. Okay. Another major issue was the problem of, if more housing gets built here, I'm worried that lower income people will not be able to afford it and will be pushed out. And the evidence indicates that, in fact, having more housing reduces the amount of displacement, and that even where you do see any displacement, it's very, very small, less than 1%. And you may see more people moving out, 1% more people moving out, but you'll also see a lot more lower income people moving in to the neighborhood, taking some of the homes that people moving sort of up the chain are moving to. So those are the bottom line conclusions, and I'm happy to talk about any of those in detail. I have more slides here, but I want to also get to questions. So the bottom line is, we have a housing crisis. You know that, or you wouldn't be here. We have a housing crisis. We have a lot of tools. People are doing some really innovative things around the country, lots of innovation going on to try to address this crisis. And the research is showing that it is working, that having more housing, that doing these things means that you are going to get more supply, and that having more supply is having an effect both regionally and, in some circumstances, in the neighborhood itself. So that's the bottom line, and I'm happy to take any questions.